to introduce like that. But so Dr. Cooper, thanks again for joining us. I want to get started at really the beginning for you. What was it in your life or in your journey that got you interested in not only activism, but the intersection of activism and race in sports?
Hey, well, thank you, Roddy, for that question. And for me, growing up in Greensboro, North Carolina, which many of you know not only as the headquarters of the Atlantic Coast Conference, but also the birthplace of the sit-in movements for the civil rights era. You know, for African American students at North Carolina Agricultural and Technical State University sat down at a lunch counter in Woolworths in North Carolina at the time when it was only reserved for whites. And that profound sit-in on February 1st, 1960, really spearheaded subsequent sit-ins across the country as it relates to civil disobedience for human rights and racial justice. So in terms of my early years, my early educational experience was at North Carolina Agricultural and Technical State University with the child labs for preschool. My mother was a professor at Bennett College, historically Black women's college in Greensboro. But I also was located in a state that created the success of Michael Jordan, legendary coaches like Dean Smith and Mike Krzyzewski, and players like Tim Duncan, Randolph Childress, David Thompson, all the ACC greats. So as a Black male at an early age, I had a strong affinity for sport. I knew that if you excelled in sport, that you could get a level of affinity and positive feedback across people from diverse backgrounds. And I knew that as a young Black male, that same attention wasn't granted to me in all spaces, not in a classroom, not in public. So for me, early on, I had an early socialization, understanding that race was more than sport, but sport was a powerful tool to bring people together across racial groups in ways that was unique.
Yeah, absolutely. And you've written about that exact statement that you just made about sports being that catalyst for activism and change. Your most recent book, A Legacy of African American Resistance and Activism Through Sport, is out now. If you could, what is the legacy of African American activism through sport, and what role has it played? Because we so often hear we don't want activism in sports, but what role has that played throughout the history of sports?
It's played a profound role in the book. So the title of the book, as you mentioned, is A Legacy of African American Resistance and Activism Through Sport. And what I document is this notion that the African American experience in the United States, both within and beyond sport, can be captured in the phrase an existence of resistance.
Hmm.
What that means is that, you know, from dating back to the 17th century when African Americans were codified as property, and then at the turn of the 20th century, there was large exclusion or nominal inclusion into sport. So I try to highlight in the trajectory of our experience, the presence and absence of African Americans has reflected the racial social order of that time. So when we look at, you know, at the turn of the 20th century, we were excluded from mainstream sports such as baseball, nominal inclusion in boxing, basketball, we were largely excluded early on. It really wasn't until the mid 20th century that you saw African American presence in sport become more mainstream. So within the text, I try to delineate resistance is a broader, more encompassing concept that talks about how we use our agency, our pioneering, our advocacy, and at times our activism and involvement in social movements and revolutions to ignite change. As it relates to activism, as you mentioned, for many in the public, when we engage in activism, whether it's within or outside of sport, it's very disruptive. And a lot of people, it makes people uncomfortable in ways that can sometimes limit the type of cross-cultural interaction that can take place. So I talk about resistance as a way of ways to make conversations occur that can be productive, Sport has been that, whether it be Jesse Owens winning 4 Olympic gold medals in 1936, at the height of a time when Hitler was promoting Nazism, whether it be Althea Gibson becoming the first African-American woman to win a Wimbledon tennis tournament, whether it be Jackie Robinson breaking the color barrier in Major League Baseball, whether it be Arthur Ashe, Muhammad Ali, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, Bill Russell, using their platforms through sport to draw attention to injustices outside of sport, as well as the more popular ones that we're aware of, Tommy Smith and John Carlos raising their black fist in the 1968 Olympics, and more recently, Colin Kaepernick taking a knee to protest racial injustice and police brutality. So within that text, I talk about how Black individuals connected to sport, African Americans, have utilized sport as a space to transform realities in society. Some of that refers to changes in sport, such as our inclusion, our representation in leadership positions, and that has shown almost like as a beacon of light to the rest of society that, hey, if we can do it here, we should be able to do it in our school systems, in our courtrooms, in our healthcare systems, in our communities. And another great example would be Venus Williams' successful lobbying of the Wimbledon tennis tournament in 2007 to provide equal prize money to men and women. So even though she didn't secure gender equity pay across the United States or across the world, she showed that if Wimbledon can do it, then we should be able to provide equity pay for women and people across all genders in society overall. And then strategically, activism is used at times to advance social justice causes. So for example, with Muhammad Ali and Kaepernick, they weren't necessarily trying to change the rules within their respective sports, but they were using their status through sport to generate change in society more broadly.
Yeah. The Colin Kaepernick thing, because it is so recent, really seemed to hit us in the face, not only when he first started with his peaceful protest of taking a knee during the national anthem, but also last year after the murder of George Floyd. Obviously, the trial of George Floyd concluded today. George Floyd's murder trial concluded today with a guilty verdict found for Derek Chauvin. How did you process that guilty verdict, and how should society at large see what is being deemed as justice for George Floyd, but how should we process it?
Yeah, it's a great question, Roddy. The way I processed it, it was emotional. Over the past several years, and once again, if we date back to the founding of this country and even prior to the founding of this country, the dehumanization and violation of Black people, and the violation of our bodies, of our communities, of our businesses, of our education, of our minds, it's been commonplace. And over the past several years, we've witnessed on camera George Floyd, Eric Gardner, several others on camera, injustices. And to perpetually see the verdict be not guilty, whether it's based on a legal technicality or any other reason, it can be very discouraging. It can be very saddening, it makes you angry, because there are people who committed mass murders, who were armed, who were of a different race, who somehow were detained without their lives being taken. But we have Black people in many cases who either were unarmed, didn't really violate a law, or if they did, it didn't render violent detainment, and then they're not convicted. So today, there was a minor exhale, and I mean that proverbially as well as literally, in honor of George Floyd and all of our brothers and sisters who've been unjustly killed, who could not breathe and who no longer can breathe. So I don't believe that justice is served, because anytime someone's life is unjustly taken, I don't think there can be full justice. But I do think the verdict today is a step in a progressive direction to hold accountable individuals who abuse their power, individuals who feel like there is no penalty for causing harm upon Black people in a society where Blackness is constantly viewed as inferior. So I would say I was very emotional today. I thought about George Floyd's family. I thought about the legacy of African-American people. I thought about the Black Lives Matter movement and the tireless effort that activists and advocates and allies have been working for years and years and years to get a resemblance of justice. And it was very emotional. So I will say that I am pleased with the verdict. I'm interested to hear what the sentencing will be, but there's still so much work for us to do in our communities. At many times, many of us as Black people, and I can speak as a Black man, we feel unsafe. We feel that, you know, someone could say that we did something that we did not, and we could be charged or we could be violated. Our lives could be taken at a whim, and there's no guarantee that the people who took our lives will be held accountable. So today, my heart goes out to the George Floyd family, and I look forward to working with all of us who are interested in manifesting true justice in our society moving forward.
Yeah. Well, George Floyd's murder last year, was a flashpoint for a lot of things, and activism among student athletes was one of those. I had not previously seen athletes en masse become activists for any sort of racial equality or any sort of racial statements, period, and not at the level that they certainly did then. If for athletes now and going forward, social media has certainly given them a large platform. What would you recommend to athletes in terms of how to use their voice to push for any sort of activism with the things that are most important to them?
That's a great question, Roddy. I'll give all of the student athletes 5 Cs to think about in terms of their development, whether it means they're engaged in activism, whether it's advocacy, whether it's allyship, whether it's using their agency, or whether it's engaging in alliances for social justice. The first C that I would tell everyone is consciousness. So educating yourself on issues that you, not only that are important to you, but are important to people you care about. So when we talk about police brutality, when we talk about anti-Asian hate, when we talk about anti-transgender hate, when we talk about anti-lesbian and gay hate, we talk about anti-queer hate, when we talk about treating people or hate or bigotry against people with unique abilities, educating yourself, listening, learning, reading from individuals who do research on these topics, for individuals who have been involved in activism on these topics. So the consciousness is the first step. The next step is thinking about, what are your convictions? What are you convicted by? And what I mean by conviction, what moves you to action? All of you who are student athletes listening today, you're convicted to be an athlete because you wouldn't spend as much time, energy, focus, dedication, and sacrifices. So you're convicted in being the best athlete you can be. I would hope that all of you are also convicted in terms of your student identity and being the best student you can be. As you pertains to conviction as a community member, think about, what is your conviction as a global citizen? When you see injustice, are you moved to action? The third thing is, do you care? So you can be conscious, you can feel convicted, but do you care enough to do something about it? The third one is courage. And as you mentioned, Roddy, I've been so inspired by the courageous actions by student athletes all across the country. I also want to tip my hat to the professional athletes like Maya Moore, LeBron James, and others who have emboldened college athletes to leverage their platforms for social change. And I also want to shout out the youth and interscholastic athletes who have also engaged in courageous actions, even when it was not the most popular. And then the last C after courage is commitment. So you all are student athletes for a short period of time, but you are going to be global citizens for the rest of your life. And so it's a matter of the issues that are important to you. Once you gain your consciousness, once you are convicted by it, once you have a level of care, and once you develop the courage to be committed to engaging in that change. So that's one thing that I would leave with the student athletes, is to really think about those things. And then, as I mentioned earlier, the 5 A's that I want the student athletes to think about. How do you use your agency on a daily basis? I would argue the transformative change that we need in our society is not only going to come through public acts of activism, it's going to come through private conversations, relationship building, resource sharing, engaging in difficult conversations when no one else is around but you and your family members, you and your friends. So thinking about how you're using your agency to engage in that change. And then, as I mentioned earlier, advocacy. Sometimes it may not be as disruptive as activism, but it could be an act as you being an advocate for somebody. It could be you being an ally. It could also be involve activism and then building alliances across different groups. So that would be my recommendation to the student athletes who are committed and passionate about pursuing social justice in society.
I want to touch on something you said, which was the private conversations, because having been in a locker room, you're around a myriad of people, especially a football locker room like the one I was in. There's 120 other guys in that locker room from all different backgrounds. If I feel convicted about something and I know that there is a member of my team or a group on my team that doesn't necessarily feel the same way, how do you approach that to have those conversations without messing up the chemistry of the team and also coming off as someone that's just trying to shove my views down your throat?
I would say first, try to engage in as much empathy and humility as you can. Remember, the way you see the world is influenced by your intersecting identities and your experiences. So if someone has not experienced what you've experienced, read what you've read, been socialized the way you've been socialized, then you cannot assume that they will understand everything the exact way you do. So it's really a matter of listening to learn, not listening to respond. Think about how you feel when someone tries to project their opinion on you. It's an invalidating feeling because you're feeling like, well, this person isn't even taking into account my feelings, my experiences, my beliefs, my way of understanding it. So you want to try to minimize you doing that to someone else. Even if you have good intentions, if you're not taking the time to listen to them, maybe they grew up in a neighborhood where they didn't know anybody who was of a different race. Maybe they grew up in a religious background where certain things were taught in a certain way. And so seeking to understand is the first step in building a bridge with someone who has a different view. The other thing that I'll highlight for student athletes and for all of us, difference of opinion does not have to equal divisiveness. Difference of opinion does not have to equal disrespect. Difference of opinion does not have to equal degradation. And oftentimes in our polarized political society, we view if you disagree with me on this, then that means that you are automatically an evil person, or you don't care, or you have harm, you're intending harm on people like me. I'm not saying that that doesn't exist at all in our society. There are people who have negative intentions and who intend to cause harm. But I would beg to argue that a vast majority of folks view the world that they view it based on their experiences and their perspective. So if you take time to build a relationship with them, think about the people who've influenced you in your life as an athlete. You had a relationship with them. Now, you may have had a role model that you looked up to on television, but in many cases, it was based on the people you had relationships with, a coach, a teammate, a parent, a sibling. So I would say nurture that relationship. Try to identify, we do this activity in Collective Uplift that I think will be helpful for you all to incorporate when you're about to have a difficult conversation with someone on a very emotional or controversial topic. Try to identify 5 things that you and that person have in common first. So before you get into, we disagree on the verdict of George Floyd, we disagree on how money should be spent in education, we disagree on policing and on mass incarceration, what are 5 things that we have in common? What are 5 interesting facts about each other that we can share that you cannot know just by looking at us? What that does is it allows the human connection to precede the political discussion, right? So if you can connect as humans first, oh, you've got a dog like I've got a dog. Your favorite color is this. Oh, you like that movie too. Oh, you were dancing to that Britney Spears song back in the day as well. right? Or whatever the case may be, that can lighten the mood. Because once again, if you're teammates with someone, you already know that we both love sport or this sport. We're both committed to that. But try to think of 5 other things that you have in common outside of your sport. That will allow next discussion to say, okay, even if we disagree on this particular topic, we already know that we have some common bond. I think also going into the conversation, having a common set of understanding. And what I mean by that is saying, before we even talk about this, let's agree that we're having this conversation in a spirit of love, that you're not trying to disrespect me. You're not trying to demean me. I'm not trying to demean you. I am going to listen to understand. I'm going to talk to try to communicate, not talk to convince or coerce or force you to agree with me, not listen to respond. So I think if you could kind of set that context initially and remember, think about anything anybody has ever told you, even those of you, all of you were being recruited. How many of you were sold on the first time the coach told you something? It probably took that coach making a lot of calls, a lot of conversations with mom and dad, with you. Hey, Roddy, don't go to Alabama or USC. We need you here at Georgia Tech. So it takes time. Give people time, give people grace. They're not going to be convinced automatically of what you're saying. They need time to process the information. They need time for the relationship to build to a point to where they can understand it. And I think if you go about it that way, the success rate of cross-cultural communication will be much higher than if you started with anger or judgment, or basically by the end of this conversation, if you don't agree with me, then we can't be friends.
Right. Well, those are powerful words. I can assure you, though, Georgia Tech did not have to worry about Alabama or USC when it came to the recruiting process for me. I want to talk a little bit about social media, because you mentioned the personal connection. What role does social media play in activism for these student athletes? Because it seems like the easiest, but also the place where you lose the thing that seems to be the most important, the personal connection that helps you affect the hearts and minds of those people that don't necessarily agree. So what is the role of social media in your eyes for these student athletes?
I think social media plays an important part of any social movement in the 21st century. I encourage all student athletes to look at social media as one tool in a larger toolkit. Social media should not be your only form of resistance, your only form of activism. It is one part of a larger puzzle. This gets back to the 5 A's I mentioned. You can engage in social media activism, but you also can use your personal agency in relationships beyond social media. You can be an advocate in spaces beyond social media as well as within. You can be an ally on social media, but outside. I would encourage student athletes to be consistent with the values that you're projecting on social media. If it's around social justice and healing, do you reflect that in your lived experience? Are you interacting with those in your circle and those outside of your inner circle in ways that reflect that same commitment? So as it pertains to activism, in the book, I highlight a typology of activism. Media activism is one type that includes social media. There's also economic activism, where you spend your money. Legal activism, what lawsuits you support or lawsuits you engage in. There's music and art activism, which oftentimes gets overlooked, very important. Scholarly activism, what you study, what you write about. There is grassroots activism, being a part of an organization on a local level, which is what we saw student athletes all across the country do at an institutional level. Put pressure on the institutions, the athletic departments and their university presidents. Hey, we need some things changed here at the university, even if we can't change it across the country. Mass mobilization activism. That's a great example of that is the Black Lives Matter movement and being connected with individuals across state lines and across national lines. And then there's civic activism. We saw that in the More Than a Vote campaign, promoting civic engagement. So these are just a few examples of different types of activism that you can activate within your lives. So I would encourage all of you, if you're going to use social media activism, I want you to think about, how do I activate my economic activism? How can I activate legal activism? How can I activate music and art activism? How can I activate grassroots activism, mass mobilization activism, and civic activism? So use social media as one part of a broader strategy that you are using to convey to the world to ignite change. Another thing that you mentioned, Roddy, social media is great for generating awareness, but it's not so great in engaging in complex, in-depth, difficult conversations. So you want to use it strategically to say, hey, we're going to generate awareness about these topics, but let's create other platforms where we can engage in more in-depth, substantive, prolonged conversations on topics that cannot be resolved in 40 characters. Right. So that's something that's important to keep in mind as well. The other thing is, with social media, be mindful and thoughtful of what you're tweeting out. If you haven't read it in its entirety, be mindful that it could be misinterpreted in certain ways. Also, be free to, as a human being, change your mind over time. You may say, hey, I tweeted this at one point when I was at this level of consciousness, but now that I have more information, I view it in this way. And that is a part of human growth. I would hope that all of you use social media to promote forgiveness, to promote giving people grace, and to not promote just judging people in negative ways.
Yeah. With student athletes and their activism and the activation, as you said, of that at the local level, we've seen some incredible successes across the country in getting names of buildings changed, in brushing up against established norms and traditions. But some of that has rankled very important boosters and donors to programs. We're seeing it play out still at the University of Texas with the Eyes of Texas song. How do student athletes manage that when they have a conviction about something like that's important to them, but it's such an ingrained part of tradition that it rankles those who seemingly have the power in athletic departments? How do student athletes, how can they manage that?
I think it comes through relationship building and courageous conversations. With many of these donors, there's oftentimes in our society an allegiance to traditions in spite of really understanding what is the origin of the tradition. So, for example, the national anthem, many people think, okay, this is nationalism, this is for the military, this is all positive. In some ways, it can convey that. In other ways, if you look at like the origins of the national anthem, Francis Scott Key's the author of it, the third stanza that refers to the enslavement of African people in a way that's not flattering, I think we should be able to have conversations about certain things in ways that honor the humanity of all of us. And oftentimes the conversations get shut down because people are committed to tradition no matter what. And the question becomes, I always like to use different analogies for people to kind of get them to see where is a touch point that may resonate with them. So for example, traditionally, women didn't have the right to vote. Should we honor the tradition that women were denied the right to vote? Or should we say, well, even though the country was founded in 1776, 1920, women earned the right to vote. We should honor that our society evolved and we grew and changed to be a more inclusive society. Whether it be other groups that have been oppressed, Native American, indigenous people, traditionally using Native American mascots was normal. Once people became more educated at some of the offensive nature of these names, not the least of which being the former mascot of the NFL team in Washington, and the heinous crimes that were associated with some of these names, we as a society evolved and became more inclusive and respectful. So the idea of ruffling feathers, that comes with the territory of pushing progressive, positive change in our society. As I mentioned, individuals with unique abilities, or what some refer to as disabilities, have not always been treated well. The American Disabilities Act was passed in 1992. The country was founded in 1776. Some things had to be wrinkled and changed in order for that to happen. Civil rights movement in the 1960s. As I mentioned, Title IX in 1972. So a part of it to me is that the student athletes should work with their administration, the athletic department, and the donors to have courageous conversations. Let's understand where each other are coming from. Let's have conversations about why certain changes would be beneficial in terms of inclusion. I always encourage student athletes to look at the mission statements of the universities and the athletic departments, which oftentimes say we value diversity, we value inclusion, we value equity, or something of that nature, and start the conversations with that language. That, okay, if we value this, let's have a conversation around how some of these statutes could create feelings of unwelcomeness for some of our student athletes. Some of our student athletes are descendants of African Americans who were enslaved by some of these statues that are erected. How does that symbol show inclusivity to us? And I think through having those courageous conversations, through building relationships, over time, people will have different views. It's not always going to be easy. Once again, there can be disagreements. On some of these issues, there can be reasonable compromises, but ultimately, I just think education has to be important. Empathy and listening has to be important. And then just being persistent in certain efforts if it's focused on inclusion. And once again, inclusion doesn't mean that we include bigotry, that we include discrimination. It means that we include honoring the humanity of all groups who are committed to coexisting in a harmonious way.
Yeah. You mentioned athletic departments and mission statements, and I always find it fascinating the role that athletic directors and administration and coaches can play in this, particularly when the issues at hand that are being brought forward, they don't necessarily either agree with or understand in all cases. So if you were to talk to administrators and coaches, what role do they play in supporting the activism of student athletes, and how can they seek to understand the issues that are important to their players and their athletes?
It's a great question, and it's an important one. Our coaches play a profound role. Coaches are role models. Coaches lead. I would say take the word coaches out of it. Leaders create conditions. Conditions facilitate behavior and outcomes. So the question becomes, coach, what conditions are you creating to facilitate positive civic engagement among your college athletes, your student athletes? This notion that activism is antithetical to being an American citizen, the country was established on some form of activism. Like, I mean, the notion of saying, hey, give me liberty or give me death, the notion of saying, no, we don't want to be taxed without representation, activism is in the lifeblood of our country. So I think one thing that coaches can do, even if they disagree with the stance of their student athletes, is to take advice I gave earlier. Do not project your own view on others. You share your view, you respect the view of your student athletes who may have a different view, and you say you support their right to engage in whatever activism they choose to engage in. Now, obviously, if it's illegal or if it's a form of civil disobedience, there can be more extended conversations around what that support looks like, what the responses will look like. But the spirit of a coach should be that I honor your humanity. I honor your feelings. I respect your feelings. I want to listen to you and understand where you're coming from. And I'd like to work with you to figure out what are effective ways to channel this energy and these feelings and these beliefs in a productive way. And I think as long as the coaches approaches in that manner, I think it's incumbent upon the coaches. This is where the conditions within athletic departments are important around having ongoing conversations around anti-racism, anti-sexism, anti-ableism, because the coaches need to be educated on these topics just like the student athletes do. You know, everybody needs to have some common language around, so what does discrimination mean? What does bigotry mean? What does racism look like in different spaces? What does sexism look like in different spaces? So I think as long as the coaches are committed to creating those conditions, to listening, to learning, to supporting, right? Remember, as I mentioned earlier, even if you disagree, it doesn't have to mean divisiveness, right? I mean, you know, student athletes and coaches, every time a play is called, does everybody agree on the play, right? There's no wide receiver I've ever met that said the running play, right? So you disagree on that play call, but you still run your route, right? Because it's for the collective good of the team, right? You, as a running back, you want to get more carries, right? But maybe you got a Tim Tebow type quarterback who likes to run more, right? And so you may say, hey, hand the ball off to me, right? But you can have that conversation. So that's another thing I think coaches can do, as well as student athletes. Try to use athletic metaphors, particularly as it pertains to teamwork, to handling adversity and differences within an athletic context, and make that analogous to conversations outside of sport. That yes, we may disagree on these things, but don't we all wear the same uniform on game day? Don't we all want what's in our best interest as a team? Nobody wants anybody else to be harmed. Well, if you don't want me to be harmed by a illegal hit or play on the field, you should also not want me to be harmed outside of the field when I'm walking to class, or getting out of my car, or getting gas at a gas station. So if you care about me with my uniform on, care about me with my uniform off, because it's not the uniform that is the basis of your care, it's my humanity. And I think if that could be the center of the conversation, then I think coaches can be stronger advocates for change, stronger activists themselves. I think there's certain things that coaches should lead the charge in saying that we condemn certain forms of hate. Student athletes have taken the lead a whole lot on a lot of these issues, and I would love to see these coaches engage in courageous, transformational leadership. And that means condemning hatred, condemning bigotry, condemning discrimination, condemning police brutality. Being against police brutality has nothing to do with disrespecting police. Policing is a good thing. Police brutality is a bad thing. Different racial groups is a good thing. Racism is a bad thing. Different genders and sexes are a good thing. Sexism is a bad thing. So I think we can delineate differences are not the problem. Mistreatment and injustice and hatred, that's the problem.
Yeah, I love
to use the metaphor sports versus racism, sports versus sexism. So if you're involved in sport, we're against these things because those things divide us. And we know in any team sport, if you're divided, the team that's more cohesive is going to be more successful.
Yeah, I love the analogies in bringing it, sort of making it hit home for student athletes, because you're right. There's never been a running back that's been on board with a goal line fade down close to the end zone. We're not throwing the ball close to the end zone in my eyes if I'm a running back, but you still got to run the play anyway.
Still got to run the
play. We've got some really good questions coming in, so I want to get to those in a second, but I'll give you an opportunity. I've got one more for you. If I'm an entry-level activist, let's say, I know that I want to get started in activism, but I don't know where to start. I don't know if anybody agrees with what I see, if anybody around me agrees on my stances. I don't know how to get started with my activism or where to start. How would you advise that person?
That's a great question. I mean, in every community, or many communities, there are local organizations that are engaged in activism. So I would, research local activist organizations in your local community. Not so much that you have to join initially, but to learn from them. Say, hey, do you have things on your platform or on your website that I can review to see if they're in alignment with my values? Can I look at some of the events and efforts that you've engaged in? So that would be the first thing. In your local community, on campus, there are student organizations, cultural affinity groups, there are cultural centers, there are institutes at some schools, ethnic institutes. There are faculty members who are a part of different areas of study, different disciplines that you can learn from and you can listen to. So that would be the first in terms of doing your research. I think there's a number of books out there beyond my own book. There's a number of books that focus on activism. Research the legacy of Billie Jean King. Research Dr. Harry Edwards. Research sport individuals like Paul Robeson and find out, okay, what were their stances on different issues? How did they leverage their activism? So that would be the other thing that I would say in terms of, as an early activist, kind of just developing knowledge around what are some issues. Research the Black Lives Matter website. Is this something, do I agree with their platform, right? What about the women's movement and feminist organizations and stances? What are they involved in? What are their stances? What are their political? The Women in Sports Foundation is a great organization to research and say, hey, and so in addition to looking up foundations and advocacy groups, remember, activism is not the only way to ignite positive change. And I hope that's one of the takeaway messages tonight. Activism is and can be a part of a broader social change movement, but it's not the only way, right? So like I said, there's a lot of agency that takes place in personal relationships that wouldn't necessarily be called activism, but that could lead to as much, if not more, transformative change than participating in a boycott or a protest, than filing a lawsuit, than divesting money from certain institutions. So remember, have this broader apparatus of ways in which you're going to go about social change in that regard. In terms of other things as an early activist, I would just say pay attention to the news. Pay attention to the news. And I know that seems to be kind of like, well, you know, that seems common. No. Pay attention to the news with a critical eye. Ask yourself what's being reported on, what's not being reported on. Who's being represented, whose voices are being heard, and which ones are being silenced or marginalized. Do research on those groups. Another one that I'll mention is Native American and tribal organizations and activist organizations. Those will be great to research. Once again, you're researching to learn about what do they stand for, how do they go about pursuing the change that they seek, and how does that resonate with me? And then once you do your research, once you connect with different organizations and different individuals, ultimately, this is where it comes down to you. What type of actions are you going to engage in, right? There's numerous podcasts. There's a collection of great journalists, intellectuals, scholars, a group of women. I believe the podcast is called Burn It All Down. Great podcast that just generates insightful thinking around these topics. So those would be the ones that I would recommend. And obviously, like I said, I've got a plethora of work on my own that people can research that can also give you references that you can research that could help you in that journey as well.
Absolutely. So I want to get into some of the questions because we've had a few really good ones come in. As a reminder to everybody who's attending, if you want to use the Q&A feature, you can ask your questions there. A question from Mary. What is a suggested setting for conducting difficult conversations? One-on-one, group setting with role play?
Great question, Mary. I give you these two words that I give all my students, and they normally get a little frustrated with me. I want a straightforward answer. It depends. It depends. It depends on the relationship you have with that person. It depends on the timing of the situation. I would encourage you to be thoughtful about the setting. I do think that settings that are not in a public domain, i.e. social media, i.e. in a classroom, i.e. in a public forum, oftentimes people will get defensive. And when they get defensive, they're oftentimes not listening. And in order for people to grow, there has to be a level of listening, internalization, and critical reflection. So whatever setting you think would optimize their ability to listen, internalize, and critically reflect, that would be the setting to best approach it. I know for our organization, Collective Uplift, when we were at UConn, our small group settings were the most comfortable. We did it outside of the athletic department. It was on campus in a small room, and we would have very difficult conversations. but we agreed that what we talked about didn't leave that room. This was for our edification, for us to better understand each other. It was a judgment-free zone, and we had those. Other times, one-on-one conversations are more effective. Whatever the nature of the relationship is, it's less about the setting, it's more about the intent and the vibe in that space. If the vibe in that space is of open-mindedness, of willing to grow, you could do that in the middle of a football field. You could do that in a library. You could do that in a barbershop or a salon, in a restaurant. You could do it anywhere, but it's more about what is the vibe, what is the spirit, if you will, in that space, and are all people who are there willing to engage in that way. The other thing that I'll mention is keep in mind the idea of planting seeds. So let's say you have a conversation in class, and I do encourage you to be engaged in your classrooms, virtually or in person. You may say something that you don't convince a classmate in that moment, but by you speaking your truth and conveying in an authentic way a perspective that is true to you, that can have a profound impact on a classmate, a professor, teacher, and you never know how that impacted them. That gets back to that agency piece. You exercising your agency, being an ally or an advocate, even before you go to being an activist, that can have a profound impact on those people who you're interacting with in way more than you will ever be able to know. So never underestimate the power of your agency in a private setting and or a public setting. Mm. Oh, you're welcome, Mary.
Our next question comes from another one of the attendees. As student athletes prepare for the next stage of their lives after college, what advice would you offer on activating their activism as a new employee within an organization?
I would say first, listen and learn. When I was younger, my mother would always tell me, we got 2 ears and 2 eyes and 1 mouth for a reason. We should listen and watch more before we speak. So before anything, learn about your organization. Ask questions. What type of charity events and causes are we involved in? What type of activism do we support or not support? So listen and ask questions, do your research, read through the employee handbook and manual, the artifacts, the institutional documents, because by doing your due diligence on the front end, when you bring up difficult conversations later, you can leverage what the organization has already said and done to say, well, hey, this isn't as far of a stretch from this as we may think. So if you just started the conversation with, hey, I want you to support this protest, this rally, I want you to divest money from this source, before doing your research, before building relationships with folks in the organization, that would be what I would say. Also, when you're doing your research and getting to know people in the organization, you're going to learn information that isn't on the website. Remember the activity I mentioned earlier about identifying 5 things you have in common with someone without, or having them mention 5 things about themselves that you can't know just by looking at them. There could be many people in that organization who are actively involved or supportive of activist organizations that you wouldn't even know if you assume that just because it wasn't on the website or that the organization doesn't promote it in a certain way, that they're not committed to these things. So I would say do your research, listen and learn, build relationships, and at the appropriate time, it could be 3 months into your position, 6 months, a year, start proposing ideas, saying, hey, would we be supportive of having this type of 5K event to raise money for this cause? Would we be supportive of having a voter registration drive? Would we be supportive of showing support for this particular cause? You'll have a lot more leverage and influence if you took time to listen and learn and build relationships first, than if you just came into the organization saying, you all should support whatever I say, and I'm brand new to this organization, right? So if you do it in a very strategic, deliberate manner, I would think that that could lead to an increased likelihood of building organizational capacity to support the causes that are important to you.
All right, we've got another one from Kelvin.
Okay.
Many institutions have created a chief diversity officer role. How should institutions utilize this role in today's climate?
Number one, they should not place all the responsibility of diversity, equity, and inclusion on that one person, regardless of who they are and what their race is. So number one, that person should be one of the leaders of the efforts, but working in concert with all of the coaches, the athletic directors, the staff, the faculty, and everyone else on campus. Because diversity, equity, and inclusion is all of our responsibilities. I'm a big proponent of alliances. So I like the idea of a chief diversity officer of the university working in concert with the chief diversity officer in the athletics department. I like for like the ACC, this forum here, bringing together different institutions and student athletes to engage in these type of meaningful conversations and interactions. So I think in terms of those roles, I think that's an important symbolic step, but that in and of itself isn't the whole answer. What we should be calling for is systemic, substantive change, whereby it's not just one person, but what about having, instead of just having a chief diversity officer, what about saying every team needs to engage in not just our general community outreach efforts, but every team should work with this officer to come up with a diversity, equity, and inclusion action plan. What are we doing to foster diversity amongst our team? And I'm not just saying coming in the huddle, 1, 2, 3 team, right? I'm not just saying we all run, sprint, and gassers together. Okay, that fit diversity on some level. But we're talking about what are we doing to condemn racism? What are we doing to condemn sexism? What are we doing to condemn ableism? What are we doing to condemn transphobia? That's the type of courageous leadership that when that is taking place systematically throughout an organization, it won't just be the responsibility of one person. So, that one person can help facilitate a framework, can help facilitate relationships, but ultimately, I think that everyone in the organization should take a leadership role in working together to promote diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Yeah, completely agree. Well, Dr. Cooper, we're nearing the end of our time. I really appreciate you coming on this forum and having a meaningful conversation. I hope it was meaningful. It was certainly insightful on my end. Where can people find your work? Tell the people out there if they want to learn more about the research that you're doing and what you're putting out, where they can find it.
Absolutely. I'm on Twitter. My Twitter is JNCOOP05, JNCOOP05. You can look me up on Google, Joseph N. Cooper at UMass Boston. You can email me, josephin.cooper@umb.edu. Once again, that you can find that on Google. And if you're interested in any of the research, you can email me. I'm more than happy to share it with you. Some of it is on ResearchGate. Much of it is on Google Scholar. In terms of the books, I have 4 books. The most recent one is A Legacy of African-American Resistance and Activism Through Sport. That you can just Google that title. It's on Amazon. 2 of the books are on peterlang.com, PETERLANG, that's the name of the publisher. The other book is From Exploitation Back to Empowerment, Black Male Holistic Underdevelopment Through Sport and Miseducation. Another book that we have out is Critical Race Theory and the Athletic Experience. That was published through Palgrave Macmillan. So you can Google that one, Critical Race Theory and the Athletic Experience, and the link will come up for that. And then we did another book on the athletic experiences at historically Black colleges and universities, past, present, and persistence. And that was published through Rowan and Littlefield. So if you email me, I'll be more than happy to share those links. But if you Google my name and the research and anything around race and sport, they'll come up. And like I said, you can find it. Your librarians at your university can also help you locate some of these articles that are through subscriptions and peer-reviewed journals, so you don't have to pay to access them. So just go to your librarian and say, hey, I'm looking up the research of this professor. Could you help me find it? And I'll be more than happy to help you all in that way as well.
Well, Dr. Cooper, this was a true pleasure. Again, I really appreciate you for joining and having this conversation and helping enlighten the student athletes and all of the people who joined us. For everybody who joined us for this conversation, I appreciate you for joining us. Pass it on the information to your friends. This is going to be put, I believe, all over social media and YouTube. So if they did not catch it live, they certainly can. But Dr. Cooper, thank you for your time and certainly for your words and perspective.
No, thank you, Roddy. I mean, you exemplify being more than an athlete, how you have gone on in your professional career and activated your transferable skills using your platform, your representation is very inspiring. So thank you for the great work that you're doing for the network and being a positive role model and mentor for current and future student athletes.
I appreciate the kind words, and thank you, everybody.
Yes, once again, thank you, everyone. Roddy, Dr. Cooper, we appreciate you all. Thank everyone for taking your time and joining us this evening. Would encourage everyone to join us tomorrow night as we have our second in our series of 3 webinars. Joining us tomorrow night, we have Lanita Baker, who's the family attorney for Breonna Taylor's family. And she'll be joining us once again tomorrow night, beginning at 7 o'clock p.m. Everyone have a wonderful evening, and we'll see you tomorrow.